Okay. My name is Meghan Armstrong-Abrami, and I'm a professor of linguistics, Spanish linguistics, at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I am very grateful to be with Doctors Narvaez and Bradshaw this morning to talk about their forthcoming book that's coming out this summer, The Evolved Nest, Nature's Way of Raising Children and Creating Connected Communities. I wanted to preface the interview just telling you how grateful I am that this book exists at all. I found it to be beautifully written, very easy to read, while at the same time maintaining scientific rigor. And just so incredibly eye-opening, even for someone like me who kind of started my journey into learning about nestedness with the birth of my son 6 years ago. And I'm constantly learning, but I felt like specifically this book had a lot of just really striking examples that wowed me and gave me insight into what's going on with our society right now. Just to, talk more generally about the book, in reading it, each chapter is artfully designed to highlight a concept of nestedness through the lens of a given species. And these are all followed by useful applications for understanding the care of human young. I found it to be a treasure trove of striking reminders of the importance of nestedness elements and what happens when you take these elements away. I sincerely hope that this book will reach a wide audience because the reader comes away with this with an urgently needed, or what I consider to be an urgently needed, insight into our present day societal woes. And without this insight becoming common knowledge, it's kind of hard to imagine a restorative path. So thank you so much for this contribution that is really needed right now, as many of us know. So I wanted to start off with a really broad question. For those who aren't familiar with the concept of the evolved nest and nestedness in general, could you just briefly talk about what this concept entails and what the animals in this book have in common with respect to nestedness?
Sure, I can start. The evolved nest is an idea that comes from the ethnographers who have examined our species' ways of raising children all over the world that were similar. And they've noticed the same kind of characteristics and wondered whether it mattered for human development. And so my lab has been looking at that question and studying whether the elements that we've identified, we expanded the list from the ethnographers, whether it matters for, health and well-being and for social capacities and moral capacities. And it turns out that every animal has a nest, and these nests are set up to match the maturational schedule of the young. And it's so fun to know that the common characteristics that we share with other animals are really vital for the health of all of us, human and non-human.
And can I ask what you've found in your lab when looking at these elements? Are there, I guess I'm wondering, for someone who doesn't have any of them, right? Is it helpful to just have one? Can that be restorative?
Yeah, so my work has been looking at the neurobiological elements of early life experience on later capacities, summarizing research, integrating research, and then trying to look at them longitudinally with the mother-child data set. And so it's very preliminary work because we've been working on a shoestring budget. So we haven't been able to do the deep kind of dive to figure out whether one element will save you or not. Although I should probably mention the elements, and then we can go into the different animals we talk about and their practices as well. So the elements are soothing perinatal experience. So that means soothing gestation, pregnancy, Mother feels supported, the baby is welcome, a soothing birth experience so that there's no painful procedures, no separation of mom and baby, that kind of thing, no circumcision. And then post-birth is a lot of support so that mom and baby can bond because their bodies are ready to bond immediately after birth. The reward systems are all set up for that. And then lots of support of mom laying in, over the number of weeks. So the mother's body and the baby are kind of able to ease into one another. Then there's breastfeeding for several years on request. The baby's guided by baby. There's 24/7 pretty much touch and no negative touch, a lot of affectionate touch, welcoming social climate so that the baby and mother feel like they are part of the community and they matter and they belong and have all sorts of supports, self-directed play, free play that the child has with multiple age playmates throughout life. So the nestedness for all of us is everything except the birth and the breastfeeding, we assume, is only for early life, but the rest of them are for everybody. So social, welcoming social climate, self-directed free play, multiple mentors and caregivers who are responsive to your needs. You feel like you have people who are listening to you, for example. And then there's nature immersion and connection so that you feel connected to the animals and plants and the landscape around you. You feel ethically responsible for it, and you enhance their well-being as your own because you feel part of the earth community. And then finally, routine healing practices, daily practices to cleanse out any resentments, to rebalance your health and your relationships and your orientation to oneness, essentially. So those are the kind of basic practices. And we've been looking at different aspects of those in our lab, finding, evidence. I mean, this is a baseline. These are baselines for normal development in humanity and in the animals that we study. And when you violate or miss one, that's a risk factor for things going wrong in your health, your well-being, your vagus nerve, all sorts of things we could talk about. So these are baselines for normal human development and maintaining our human nature of compassionate cooperation.
Thank you. In taking what you just said and thinking about how there's a mental health crisis in our country and many other Western countries, how do you see the evolvedness relating to our current mental health crisis?
Well, we routinely distress babies, and there's a lot of myths about, oh, it doesn't matter. Babies are resilient. Oh, it's genetic. Oh, you got to, don't spoil the baby by giving them too much attention. This is all backwards because you're now seeding dysregulation, you're seeding depression, anxiety, a very basic existential fear. If you leave a baby alone or leave them alone to cry, you can't, that's fear driven life then has been seeded. And that's then linked to all sorts of mental health problems as well as physical health problems. So we, our nest is there to support well-being and health and happiness and joy and cooperation and feeling comfortable in the world. And we're doing almost the opposite without mindlessly, really, and mythologically.
How did you choose the specific animals that you talked about in the book?
Yeah, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I'll just make a comment just about the elements that Darcia was listing. Is that the last one she listed was immersion in nature. And so when you look at animals, non-human animals, that's a given. they can't just kind of hang in the air away from the rest of nature. And I think that really this work together has really emphasized that our non-human animal kin, and I would say, we can even talk about plants, but definitely with the animals that's the baseline. And then we can look at our practices, like, Darcia was just mentioning, in terms of how we live in this alienated, fearful, and, cold world, human world, we can look at that deviation or that difference as a measure of the stress and the trauma and the disease that a child grows up in. And even within the family, nested within the community in the larger culture. So if these are all sort of in nestedness in terms of that. And back to your question about how we chose the animals, it was kind of organic, I think both of us had sort of a proclivity for certain species and all. But essentially the choice really came down, and the choice came down to like, oh, that's a really good example. So for example, the emperor penguin, the emperor penguins, the mother, they're in the Antarctic and they're really tall. I mean, probably people are familiar because they've been popularized. Mother has the egg, and then she leaves. She and the other, they live in a colony, and she and the other mothers leave for the ocean. It's usually 100 miles or so because they're depleted and the weather is extreme. And so the egg, she immediately transfers the egg to the father penguin, and he puts it in his feathered pouch, and he cares for the egg until it's birthing. And he, huddles, that's a technical term, with all the other penguins. So in that case, what we were also showing with that one was we chose the penguin because they're birds, and also because there's this wonderful example of co-parenting and nested within that, the community. This is a community of males, and then the females come back, and then the shift comes, etc. But you really see the very deep patterns of caregiving and nestedness in that way. And then some, for example, like the moral commitment chapter, which is the penultimate chapter. I'm not sure how we chose that, Darcia, but it was a really good one because it was about wolves. And perhaps there was an unconscious thing of saying, okay, wolves have this portrait of being vicious, and it's reported even in the scientific literature. Some of the scientific literature says that they're very, the groups are very hierarchical, and they're aggressive and they're competitive. And when you look very closely, what you see is a very well-knit, caring, cooperative family and community. This is not just within the family or just within the parents. You see, of course, there's the classic elephant, right? Everyone knows the elephants. They come together and they're allo-mothering and things like that. I mean, they're well known for their mothering and their caring. But the wolves, it's sort of like, doesn't matter who you are. There are these same principles and same patterns of caring that, like Darcia had mentioned right there. And they're just like, they unfold very naturally in that way. So while there's obviously that there's differences, penguins are like this, and elephants are like this with their thing, and octopus, that when you just sort of peel away the outer form, you see that there are these, principles and ways of caregiving and being with each other that cross all species.
And I wanted to thank you too for the emperor penguin example, because I found, and you stated in the chapter as well, the difficulty that the mother faces when she does go off, because she's kind of torn. She doesn't want to leave, but then she really needs to leave. And I feel like that's so relatable, especially in an unnested culture, where we're, working as a nuclear family, without the generational support, without the large caretaker groups that our species needs. And so, and especially for those of us who are working, we're so depleted, and we need to care for our bodies and rejuvenate so that we can care for our children. But you're torn, right? It's not an easy, you don't want to have to leave and go do what you need to do because you want to be with your children. But so I identified with the mother.
Yeah, what it really underscores is that even though the mothers have to leave, because they're depleted, there's this continuity of care. There is no broken chain of care.
Right.
It's absolutely seamless. And again, it's nested in the sense of within the community and other members. So it's a
Right.
very coherent and cohesive environment in which a baby is born.
I would like to connect an anecdote here. And I mainly approach, I have an interesting approach to this as a mother and a linguist and someone who's trying to like understand how academically I can connect to this work, because I think it's probably, it's really important work. So my questions will kind of sort of move around from those different lenses. So the anecdote that I'll connect here in terms of, this idea of continuous care. So I was recently looking for childcare for my daughter, and with my son, he went to a Reggio school, and they were very open to us sort of doing what Scandinavian countries know how to do, sort of our best shot at continuous care, where the parents can be around, and you're not just dropping off your child and saying goodbye. You're going with them for a while and instilling some kind of trust in the new caretakers, right? Kind of like passing the baton a little bit. And in interviewing a care center recently, I had asked what their process for this was. And for a lot of places, this has changed a lot with COVID and, not being able to go into the building for parents, but now for most places you can. And they said, oh, well, this should be a place for your child, and she should understand that this is her place to go. And so it's best for you on the first day to drop her off, and then say goodbye and turn around, and you go, and she understands that this is her place. And I was so glad that I was a second-time parent when I heard this, because I don't know how I would have responded when I was less educated about these types of things. But my response to her was, sure, that would be great if we were in a society where all the people who worked here were people that my child knew and trusted, and that we were completely aligned on our caretaking practices. But that's not the case. And I can't imagine what my daughter would think if I just left her and turned around and left, and she was with these people that she didn't know or trust. I think that would be pretty traumatic for her. But that seems to be kind of the baseline expectation in most care centers in the US. And I mean, we live in an area where, I think that there are more gentle approaches compared to other parts of the country. So I can't even imagine what other practices look like. But I just thought if you might be able to comment on our setup of childcare in the US, and in a place where mothers don't have very much leave at all. And so if you need to make a living through your career, you have to leave your child with someone. And oftentimes there's not a caretaker at home. And so I just wondered what your thoughts were, again, connecting that to, this sort of seamless connection, contrasting that with this sort of rip the Band-Aid off, drop your child off at a place where they don't trust the caretakers. They're not part of your social network, and sort of what sort of implications that might have societally.
Well, I'll start. This is something reflected in what the psychiatrist Ian Suttie identified back in the 30s, that the U.S. has a taboo on tenderness. And it's reflected here in the childcare approaches outside the home, but also in the home, right, where you think it's okay for babies to cry. It's also at birth practices where it's okay to manhandle babies and separate them and test them and poke them and all this stuff. And if they just get distressed, you ignore it. And then the parents learn from the ignoring of baby's distress that that's okay to do, right? So professionals are seeding that. And what we see in Hollywood movies too, the babies are crying. I can't stand it when there's a movie that has a baby in distress. I have to turn it off. And so the whole society is oriented to cruelty, really. And I think that's reflected in all sorts of practices at multiple levels and institutions. And it's also a part of the ignorance about child development, which hopefully now is starting to shift as we understand adverse childhood experiences have long-term effects on health and well-being. Although the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences measures, are only looking at childhood, sexual and physical abuse and things like that. They're not looking at babyhood. And so I've put together a baby bill of rights, because the first 4 years of life are really critical for setting up your health and well-being. And so it needs to be tender and loving, and the kinds of things we describe in the animal nests that we have in the book. Okay,
And
maybe
that's
say something about that. Well, go ahead.
Well, yeah, and again, I just want to emphasize, that what has come from the neurosciences, and it really is the root of all biomedical research, is that all animals have the same brain structures and processes and capacities that we do, for thinking, feeling, consciousness, and everything. So we're not like looking at animals as, oh, isn't that interesting out there? Or even in the sense of traditional, as Darcia's written extensively about traditional ancestral human societies. It's not like, oh, that's interesting. It's like, wow, why aren't we like that? And okay, we're not like that. And what does that mean? So, the whole idea of bringing ourselves, quote unquote, back to nature, into the same processes and patterns of caregiving of the nest in different animal societies is really our healing path in that way. And I agree with Darcia, if you see on the television a baby, I even feel like seeing a baby on television is kind of shocking.
Here, I can't watch most shows.
Well, I find it shocking because whose baby is this, and he or she's a prop, right?
Mhm.
I find that really appalling. And in terms of the animals, they there is no separation. It's like watching dancers. Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Everything they do is in sync, and everything is everyone kind of agrees on. Like in the Wolf Society, they have, this is just a sort of a kind of a significant fact, is that there's a mother and father who have the male and female have kids, and the other wolves are helpers. Even young male wolves, they help. And so it's not like the baby is never isolated in that way. It's not like everyone's fawning over but the point is that the baby is part of the society, part of it immediately, or even before birth in that way.
I think that everyone agrees thing is so important, and the loss of that is so horrible for parents right now, because when you look at all of these elements that I want to be able to give my child, right? Like if we think about play, my first child, half of his life was lived in the pandemic. And yes, I want to be able to let him run free in our neighborhood, but the parenting styles clash so horrible, within our society. You would each household has such different ideas about child rearing, and it's just so hard to trust someone, because knowing that what we're talking about right now is not really common knowledge. It's not what the mainstream accepts. So you want to give your children these opportunities, but it's like, how do we do that? And I think this kind of work is so great, because we can start to pull together around these concepts that are clearly defined for us, and then we can say, all right, who's interested in raising their children in a nested community. I think it'll be really useful for applying. I also think that someone should write a book on the portrayal of child rearing in the media. It's precisely for the reasons you've both pointed out. There's a show called Working Moms. And I think it tries to highlight the issues that working mothers face, and it has puts on television things that probably weren't on television before, but it also replicates this, like, the children disappear, right? Like you'll see the characters like doing their lives and you won't even remember that they have children for, and they're little children who take up a lot of your time. And when you're a parent of a very small child, it's very centered on them. So to not see the children even appear in many episodes is kind of strange. But then it normalizes that kind of thing, right? And yeah, just like holding a colicky baby and like, jolting them up and down in a very, non-natural way. There's all of these disturbing practices that I think are normalized through the media. It would be, I keep thinking that it would be really interesting for someone to just kind of take a few shows and movies and do an analysis of child care practices there.
You brought up, excuse me, you brought up a really
Sorry.
good, the second half of the subtitle of our book is Creating Connected Communities. And that's so important, is the adult, I mean, it doesn't have to be adults, it's, teenagers or whatever, but those relationships, in other words, as Darcia pointed out, the evolved nest is directed at child care and babyhood and things like that, but it can't work unless you have the same thing happening within the larger community. So building relationships within, from adult to adult, family to family is vital. Darcia, would you say?
Yes, absolutely. And that's another area where we're disconnected, right? We're disconnected from our heritages, our sense of who we are as a species, from our sense of relationship to the rest of the natural world. A lot of disconnection going on. And the system we live in likes that, because isolating and then selling things to you because you feel so disconnected and unhappy, but you'll buy this product because it's going to help you feel connected, right? So it's just built, the incentives in the system are in the wrong direction. So we have to look at that level too, although we don't too much in this book.
Yeah, I think I think, is it called Happy Baby? I think Harvey Karp's book that a lot of parents get, and they talk about like all of these soothing activities you can do with your child, but there's actually a contraption associated with that narrative. He talks about the fourth trimester, which I think caught on in kind of like in the popular world, but so we're finally understanding that it's a shock for the baby to be out of your body. But I think they have the SNU, for example, is supposed to replicate the womb, and parents can get more sleep. And so you think of it and you're like, oh, this is good for my baby, right? Like my baby's going to feel like it's inside my womb, but nobody's saying, oh, through your body, you can help your baby do that in a much more natural and way that has been practiced, throughout humanity. And so we're not getting that information. You're immediately bombarded by what contraptions can help you get sleep. That's like, as soon as you get pregnant, that's sort of what people are telling you, like, buy this, you'll be able to sleep. And no one's saying, oh, breastfeeding will help your child to co-regulate, and your child nursing through the night will keep your supply up. Those are not the mainstream messages, and they're definitely not in the media. I think people have been talking a lot about the show Bluey, the cartoon Bluey, because there are some examples of family bed and co-sleeping in that show. And I think those of us who are advocating it are kind of like hungry for anything in the media that normalizes these practices.
Right. People need to understand that babies are like fetuses of other animals. Human babies are like fetuses of other animals until about 18 months of age. So they need an external womb experience. That means a calming environment that whole time, at least that long, meeting their needs immediately. And that means skin to skin, pretty much, carrying them and holding them all 24/7, physical presence, because all the various neurobiological systems are setting themselves up for a lifetime, right? Is how well the stress response works. And the vagus nerve is all being co-regulated by the caregiver. And if you leave the baby alone, it's like things get dysregulated, and then you're establishing dysregulation for a lifetime. And it's really hard to fix later when you're an adult. All those systems, because there's sensitive periods for different things, and we can't do experiments to know exactly when, and every baby's different.
Right.
So you have to provide the evolved nest so that's a buffer for whatever else, the pace of development for that particular child, and whatever maturational things are scheduled to grow at that time. So it's the right hemisphere in particular is growing more rapidly in early life, and that's what we undermine, and that's linked. Its functioning is linked to happiness and empathy and self-control and all sorts of things that we think now is normal to see adults who are aggressive and self-centered and dysregulated and angry, which is a left brain emotion, unlike all the others. So we've gotten our baselines are what we think is normal really are off kilter.
And there's almost a stigma against empathy, I think. I worked on a linguistic phenomenon called uptalk, which is when you rise at the end of sentences, like I am right now. And, you know, it has evolved as a way of checking in with the listener, right? Like, you know, trying to get like what you're nodding as I say, right. And we can sort of navigate the conversation like that. And there's all this pressure on women to lower their voices at the end and sound, you know, more definitive. And it's like you erase the empathy through that. And I think, you know, there's this kind of like pressure to not be empathetic, or else you're not asserting yourself. And so just empathy in general, I feel like has been stigmatized.
Well, that's the left brain. So what happens when we undermine early life experience, when we don't provide the nest to the young, they have a gap in their development. So the right hemisphere is underdeveloped. Then we send them to school. Well, actually, before that, we're enhancing the survival systems, the systems of rage and fear and the stress response. Because they're stressed so much, they're in that state a lot. And so those things get more habitual. Then we send them to school. And school is all about left brain, you know, the conscious, ego consciousness, information. And the right hemisphere never catches up unless you do a lot of therapy and a lot of playing, which helps. And so the left brain is just, we know from the experiments, when you numb one side or the other of the brain, the left brain's all about dead things, likes categorizing things that are static. It cannot perceive dynamism, flow, relationships, doesn't care about that because it can't perceive them. It's the right hemisphere that knows all that stuff. And we've undermined our sensibilities to flow and relationships and flexibility and interpersonal dance, all the things we see in the animal nests that we kind of have lost in the human nest. So our Ian McGilchrist has mapped out, integrated all this information about left and right brain, and talks about how Western civilization has been taken over by left brain functioning. And here we are destroying everything because the left brain just likes its little abstract models and applies them and doesn't pay attention to all the collateral damage that's going on.
And a lot of the foundation for this understanding as such has come from experiments on animals. And so there's open knowing of doing something to a mouse or doing something to a cat or a dog or a monkey that destroys them mentally and emotionally. And that's dreadful. It's a terrible thing. And the animals who are domesticated or those in the wild, most of them are severely traumatized. And so a lot of the wildlife that we see, because deer and bear are hunted and wolves are hunted, they've witnessed they're not only prematurely weaned, as such, but they've witnessed severe trauma and they've lost it. So we're seeing these strange behaviors like the orca that you see in the news now, because they're severely traumatized, and their larger nestedness is like the elephants who had PTSD is breaking down because of human violence. So there is that knowledge, but to me, it's ironic in kind of a wicked way that we know this. The scientific community knows this. Is really denying the foundations of what that knowledge really means and implies for ourselves as well as other animals.
This is where our ancestral wisdom, indigenous wisdom, the kinship worldview, actually, they already know these things. They don't have to do experiments. They know from observation across generations. They know from having their full integrated brain that's able to observe and take in all sorts of things we can't perceive because we've undermined our brain development. You don't have to do experiments. We have the baselines. We have nestedness has been around for millions, hundreds of millions of years. And now we think, oh, I don't know, formula might be better than breast milk. You know, I mean, come on. So that's that left brain ignorant aspect of what we emphasize today.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of like what I sort of predict when I go into a conversation about these types of things, even with colleagues, right? Because you're just kind of expecting that left brain response about, well, you know, these, especially if we look at like the cried out literature, and, you know, all the work that set out to show that cried out is okay, by, you know, just measuring cortisol, right? There's so much more to what goes on in those early traumatic experiences.
Yeah, or just measuring parent reports. Oh, I feel better now. Oh, then it's working. Sleep training. Yeah, it's safe for everybody. And that really unethical studies and unethical conclusions that pediatricians are reading and doctors are reading, and they assume because they don't look at the structure of the research and know much about child development and our evolution, they think, oh yeah, it's fine. See, that experiment showed that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I we've had in prior conversations that how the dangers of the recommendations that pediatricians are making because of the, you know, 1 or 2 days they had on lactation or infant sleep, or, you know, all of the things that they don't know about and very often give very dangerous, in my opinion, advice.
Yeah, you got to follow the money too. So a lot of these.
Oh, I was handed a sleep consultant card when I told the pediatrician that I did not plan to sleep train, that my son woke throughout the night and that I nursed him throughout the night. And I was, and on his record, it was noted that he had sleep disturbances.
Normality, becomes abnormal. And
right. This was before 6 months of age. So yeah, no, we're getting, you know, where do we look, right? And I don't think there's, if you're not reading this literature, you know, if you don't have access to it, it's pretty difficult because if you're going to believe your pediatrician, right? I think, Gay, what you had said segues nicely to one of the for me, like one of the most striking examples in the book was about the importing of the Big Five to South Africa after apartheid, in the interest of fomenting ecotourism, and how all of a sudden they saw that rhinoceroses were getting killed, and it turned out to be the young male elephants, if I'm correct, that were killing the rhinoceroses. Could you talk about what happened there? And I mean, for me, that was where I was that was my like biggest aha moment, because I think if we look at what happened there and then we extract that and think about it in our society, it's just so clear. So yeah, if you could talk about that, the example of the elephants and the rhinoceroses.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary event because of a couple of reasons. So in South Africa, as you said, when apartheid was obviously going to be collapsing, and then there wouldn't be the boycotting, and there would be chances for ecotourism both on private and national parks and things like that, they imported lions and elephants and all the other animals that were, like you said, called the charismatic, that were really the draws for tourism. And in the case of elephants, at the time, they really did not have the facilities or the capacities to transport a full-grown elephant. So
Mhm.
what they did is they had mass shootings. They call them culls. They're helicopters typically with machine guns, and they come down on a family of elephants and kill them all. And then they take the babies and they tie them up. They catch them and tie them up and import them. And the photos are just awful. The eyes are bugged out. This also happens in zoos in terms of when they take the baby elephant from the mother who's chained, and they do all the tests just like they do with the human babies. And so flash forward. Okay. So there was this big, startled, that all the biologists were very startled because over a several year period, they were finding dead rhinoceroses. And at first they thought that was because of a lot of traditional medicine from Asia uses the rhinoceros horn, but then they found out that's not true. So over 100 rhinoceroses were killed. And a tourist got on video or a camera that it was an elephant, a young teenage elephant, and they were sexually assaulting the rhinoceroses. So initially, researchers thought it was because, well, they don't have, they didn't grow up in the normal family structure, so they brought in big males, bull elephants, and that helped a little bit, but it didn't last. And so I looked at it from a neuropsychological perspective, and obviously it falls out that these young male elephants, they were babies, 1 to 2 to 3 max in their age, and they were dumped into parks. They didn't know the ecology. They didn't have any kind of nothing normative for an elephant. And a baby elephant is born within the natal family, which are allo mothers. I'm going into this detail because it's exactly what Darcia has described in terms of traditional and ancestral human societies. And they're in this, sort of extended womb, of all these allo mothers. And then they basically, they breastfeed, for up to 4 years, and with other elephants as well. And they spend a lot of time with not their mother, but just the other cousins and siblings and the older elephants. And these elephants had none of that. And the male elephants, then when they're like 9, 10, 11 years old, they leave the natal family and they join what's called an all-bull group or all-bull area. That's the males, mature males. And they don't become sexually mature. It's called must, which is the hormonal excretion, until their 30s. And so these elephants that were killing the rhinoceroses were teenagers, 14, 15 years old, and they were going into must, sexual maturity, almost 20 years early, 15, 20 years early. And so when you look through that neuropsychological lens, you see that they have suffered multiple traumas, what we diagnosed, and that's I diagnosed as complex PTSD. And so when it became news, it was interesting because a number of journalists, as well as there were editorials on saying, "Oh my God, this looks just like what's happening with our kids." That they don't have, these very important neuropsychological, emotional, physiological paths and stages that are critical for normative development. And so now basically the PTSD in elephants, definitely in South Africa, is epidemic. Mothers are killing their babies. They're killing each other's babies. I mean, those things never happen at all. So unfortunately, message, people know it, but it doesn't penetrate wildlife biology. And this is not just for elephants. We're talking, as I mentioned, about all wildlife that are exposed to, just constant stress and pressure. And so you're seeing things like the orcas, who never kill humans, ramming boats. You see them, they're starving, they're being killed. There's toxic pollution, et cetera, all different kinds of stressors. So you're seeing, strange behavior in animals because their societies are broken down and they don't have that restorative well from which to draw. They don't have a mechanism for repair. So in the traditional elephant society, if some, baby elephant, was chased by a lion, that is traumatic, but there's always a mechanism for repair. There's the other elephants. It also fits within the master narrative. Yeah, things like that can happen, but there's nothing within their psychosocial, cultural narrative that talks about being slaughtered from the air with bullets and seeing your whole family killed. There's no mechanism for repair, and there's nothing to make meaning from that as well. Yeah. And so you see that writ large in our own society. When you don't have, it's not just having, it's too simplistic. Like the first attempt was to restore the male bulls because they can dominate. That was the idea. They dominate and kind of put the lid on the young elephants. Well, the young male elephants, it worked for a little while, but not. You can't just they're not building blocks. These are continuous processes. And there's this notion of, we talked about cohesion, and it's the invisible, it's the relationships which really hold things together. It's not just having, an older man or an older uncle. It's the whole connection. I mean, those are very important. And, as we talk about in the wolf chapter, and Darcia discusses elsewhere, having an older elder, if there is if that's been missing in childhood, as a teenager, having an older, wiser mentor is very helpful. But really, it's this whole notion of continuity and cohesion.
Thank you. And and I think also when the continuity has been broken, even the elders often don't have the knowledge that needs to be passed down, especially, I just think about, breastfeeding, just being pregnant, breastfeeding, all of these things that, typically you're getting all of this wisdom from multiple sources from other women. It's not there. I did wonder, do you have any ideas about, there are a lot of breastfeeding challenges for women, from not producing enough milk to tongue ties, and all different sorts of challenges. Do you think that these challenges exist because of the lack of generational knowledge? Do we know if there are less challenges for women in more nature-based societies when it comes to breastfeeding?
Yeah, there's a study put out by Amy Brown that shows that it's only really in the United States and in the United Kingdom where women have such trouble with breastfeeding. The rest of the world, it's like, what's the problem? It's like maybe 1% of women around the world elsewhere have issues that we think are normal. And she documents, and others have, all the interference that happens all along the way, the self-doubt that's put into mind that formula is just as good, almost just as good, and look, just take this free sample with you, even to breastfeeding moms.
Me
in
too.
the hospital,
Yep.
right? And
I said no. Who know? I know that people have, there's all types of things you can encounter, but I was like, I'm not using this.
And the scheduling feeding. Well, no.
Oh my gosh.
Right.
I did that. They tell you every 30 minutes, and then you go online and you just you find these schedules and you're like, this is what I need to do.
No, you got to follow the baby, right? And so we teach parents not to follow the baby. You'll spoil them, all that mythological stuff. So it's not a problem elsewhere by and large. And besides, if mother's milk doesn't come in right away, other hospitals around the world will have a wet nurse, right? Someone who gives the baby, but the baby doesn't need to eat immediately. They've bulked up for birth if they've decided their own birth. Of course, we pull babies out early now, and so everything gets all discombobulated in terms of scheduling of their readiness for this or that. And a lot of babies are drugged from the mother's epidural and labor drugs, and makes it hard for them to latch on, and they're just half asleep for the first few weeks because their body can't process all the drugs. Their liver function isn't there yet. And then so there's so many ways to undermine breastfeeding success. And baby-friendly hospitals are one measure or one approach that the World Health Organization put together back in the 90s to support breastfeeding. And one of those, and there's 10 practices, and one is don't separate the mother and baby after birth, and provide lactation support, and et cetera. But I think in the States now, maybe 30% of hospitals might be baby friendly. Back in 2011, when the Surgeon General of the US got concerned about it, only 4% of hospitals were baby friendly then. So we're making progress, but a lot of hospitals still separate mom and baby. They'll give the baby sugar water to keep them quiet, or formula for no medical reason, and all that. Having a bottle undermines the baby's ability to breastfeed. All sorts of things.
Yeah, I've had friends who I think their children have been given formula without their knowledge. We had to fight to keep my son in the room with us. There were constantly people trying to take him between doctors and residents. And we literally, like, I remember my husband standing over me because we were like, he's not going anywhere. And versus my second birth, where my daughter was with me the entire time and was able to breastfeed immediately. But it's, you actually have to fight the system in order to keep your baby with you. And I think you said before about the 24-hour skin to skin. The hospital that my son was born at, you walk in to the maternity ward, and there was like a sign. It was like, there's like a specific time, there's no visitors because it's skin to skin time, like a specific set sliver of time. And that just strikes me. I mean, when I saw it, I didn't know much about it, but it's odd, right? That, you know, there would just be this little time reserved for that, when that's just should be the baseline. I think a theme we keep coming back to, like the baselines are just not the baselines.
And the left brain loves control, loves everything ordered and, you know, sliced up, and an inability to deal with the dynamism of relationship and the tuning in to what that baby needs right now. You know?
Mm-hmm.
I think looking at these, you know, these insights, you know, that Darcia is talking about, you're talking about, it goes even deeper. Another that I see it is that having a baby becomes a commodification.
Mm.
Now, what is really the purpose of having a baby? And so, you know, and so, like I said, it's even deeper. Why are we having children? You know, and I think that's an important question for every parent to be. Why am I having a child? What's the real reason I'm having a child? So I think that this culture obviously is a commodification culture, and it starts in really very deeply. So just this kind of thing that you're talking about right there, the baby is picking up in the sense of I'm a commodity.
Mm-hmm. Right. And if I can turn you off when I need to turn you off at night because I need my sleep, and you shouldn't bother me, and I shouldn't have to feed you because I have to go to work. Yeah, it does beg the question of why are we having children if we can't nurture them the way they need to and deserve to be nurtured? I wondered, do either of you know in more nature-based human cultures if nursing is shared throughout the night between allo mothers?
I don't know about throughout the night, but certainly during the day.
I wonder from my own experience, because like I've dealt, and this could also be sort of, you know, nutrients that were lacking, like magnesium, because I've had nursing aversion during night feeds with both of my children, and I just wonder. I just am like, this doesn't, like, it has felt hard to nurse throughout the night. And because sometimes there's just nights where like my daughter will want to stay latched for like 3 hours. And my body is like, I can't do this. I can't do this. And so I've always been curious whether in other setups for sleeping, whether that labor might be shared because it doesn't seem like, I'm like, I don't think it works like this. Yeah, I just wondered if you had any ideas about how that might help.
It sounds like maybe your daughter wanted to suckle, not necessarily.
Yeah.
Right. And so fathers and grandmothers would be there to do that as well. So,
okay.
And when you know, our heritage is to sleep all in large rooms together, or shelters, not just isolating, you know, the nuclear family necessarily. And
Yeah. So
there'd
there's
be
just
other
more people around in general.
And there's not a lot of buffer, there's in our society. It's like, well, I've got to get this sleep, or, there's just no buffer that's built in. Darcia was just saying about larger families. It's fine. I mean, there's, individual buffer, and then there's environmental buffer. So losing a night of sleep is not such a big deal.
Mhm.
You can rest during the day while maybe the other parts of the family are taking care of, or something like that. So there's a lot of built-in buffering for resilience of the individuals as well as the group.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the continuum concept. I think we're like, we have this idea of like, if I don't get enough sleep, this will happen and this will happen, and you just have this anxiety around it. And I think there's a part of the continuum concept where she talks about like someone will just tell a joke in the middle of the night and everyone will laugh and then go back to sleep. And I try to remember that example sometimes. But it's if you do have to work, right, you're stressing. I mean, when I was on maternity leave, I would always sleep with my son, and I know that's contentious, and a lot of people feel that they can't do that. But again, it's because of the isolation of our nuclear families, because there's a bunch of other tasks that you have to do, it should normally be shared. But yeah, just kind of, if the stakes aren't so high, then we're sort of more relaxed about what happens at night. I know we're coming up on an hour, and I was to sort of wrap things up. You talk in the last chapter about like these grassroots efforts, right? We can start at the individual level. In a more pessimistic interpretation, to what extent do you feel like maybe it's too late? Have we gone so far? Have we spun so far off the path of our species? To what extent do you think that we can that this is restorative, that we can come back within this culture, which I think if we think about kind of a continuum of cultures from nature-based to us, maybe the US is at the far end of the continuum, and we're seeing that play out in many different ways through violence and mental health. Do you think this is just our demise, or how pessimistic or optimistic do you feel? Both of you, would be great to hear.
Well, I'm optimistic that for the species to survive and support the survival of other species as well. But if we're going to survive, we're going to have to restore not only the evolved nest, but the indigenous worldview practices, where we are members of the Earth community in all sorts of ways, and build in all these layers of resilience and buffering that Gay was talking about. So I am hopeful. Maybe not the society that we have is structured in a way to undermine all that. So we're going to have to destructure it in some fashion, and so planting seeds of where we can go. And how we can live in a way that supports happiness and health and well-being for all, I think is really important. And that's what the book is trying to signal, that we can shift. Now there's a lot of stuff to do, and perhaps things will collapse all of a sudden, because the global warming is going much more rapidly than any of the models can predict, because they don't know everything to put in the models. So these will be light posts, maybe, or lighthouses along the way back to figuring out how to be respectful, responsible members of the Earth community.
Yeah, I agree. I'm optimistic because I think it's our responsibility, and I think it really is something to everyone has to take very, very seriously, and the emphasis on being members of the Earth community is embed ourselves. It's not just us, no one thrives unless everyone thrives, and that has to include non-humans, that they have to become prioritized, because that is also our own path to returning to wholeness and well-being. So I'm optimistic. I think we have to be more blunt and honest about it, like we're saying, what is the real reason that you're having a child? you know, and what is that? What is is it really for goodness in the earth and the child? You know, that's the bear chapter, you know, should I have children? And I think these lessons are so important because they're right there and they're not foreign. They're intrinsic to our DNA, if you want to call it that way. So I'm optimistic, but I think it also goes with the fact of that we have to make a right turn now and take these things seriously, not just go, oh, yeah, that's interesting. You know, there's obviously some individuals and some families that can make bigger change than others. But at the same time, I think it's also for those who can make the change, to make the change more in support of the larger community.
I think
I'm sorry.
people have to kind of shut off all the messages, turn off social media and the television and streaming that keep telling us to buy this or buy that, and to learn to want less. In our ancestral context, they didn't want very much. They were happy to spend most of their time in leisure, fun activities, laughing and playing and singing and dancing. And they didn't need to have things. In fact, when the Europeans came to the what were later called the Americas, to Turtle Island, they said, boy, these people aren't very greedy. We got to make them greedy. Because they were happy just to live well with the earth and the natural gift economy. And we have been trained to not be satisfied, never be satisfied, right? Because we have the hole in our heart as well. But so start to shift away from all those messages, because what you hear over and over is shaping your purpose, your goals, your interests, your behavior, right? And so we can take charge of our own lives by shutting our immersing ourselves in the environments that are supporting an earth-centeredness.
No, and I think I think that this book is really a tool for us to find like-minded people. You know, as the knowledge becomes, or as the book becomes disseminated. Do you have any plans of having it translated into any other languages?
Yeah, they're in the works.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. Because yeah, the message is so important, and I think it really provides us with a framework. You know, when there's so many names for all different parenting styles, to just kind of come around what you two have lined out and say, okay, I embrace these tenets as extremely important to me. Do you agree? Because I think we find ourselves very fragmented. It's hard to find like-minded people in our communities when there's all these pressures to let your baby cry it out and stop nursing and you know, everything that's the antithesis to what you've been promoting. And so yeah, I think I'm grateful as a parent to have this tool that I think will be super useful in helping us connect and affect some real change. And to end, on an anecdote, I was reaching out to a colleague of mine who works with the Wapichana group in Brazil, and he works on language acquisition. And I'm interested in you know, cultures who talk to their babies and don't talk to their babies, and this idea of a touch being something different, right? If you're not making eye contact with your child, you are making some other kind of tactile contact. So I was interested in how these women interacted with their babies. And he was like, let me ask them. He's like, they're all here with their children. So they, you know, work with him on this language project, and they're all consultants. And he sent me this picture, and it was just like all the women and like their kids were everywhere. And I was like, that's how it should be. You know, we should, you know, why is it even, you know, within my field, why is it when we go do things like that, it's like, oh, this community does this with their kids, why can't we do that too?
Can I say one more thing?
Absolutely, please.
One of the things I think people don't realize is that when you distress a baby, a young child, 0 to 5 or 6 even, you are undermining their free will. You are creating gaps in their development that will make them more easily controllable later. The system wants that. The system wants to be able to control you and make you do what it wants, right? Which is work, 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 work. And you get anxious when you're not working, for example. So free will and freedom are part of the evolvedness way of raising the young that creates adults who have a mind of their own, who are able to, actually fulfill their human potential and the potential of the Earth community.
It reminds me of the, you remember the Free to Be You and Me album from years ago? They actually played that song in one of the gatherings at my son's school. And it reminds me of that song, which is very much in the spirit of freedom and play and, all the good things that everyone has a right to experience. Well, I think that covers, I have probably way more questions, but I'm so grateful for the book existing and hearing from both of you. And I plan to share the knowledge widely. So thank you so much for this important contribution.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you, Megan.